Greetings, freshman U.S. history students. All right, this is going to be our first note-taking experience of the year. Now, normally, if we were in class and kind of the traditional way of schooling, I would go over and spend quite a bit of time kind of front-loading how I want you to go about the notes. Hopefully, you all watched the video I posted yesterday, but just a quick recap on that. In my class, note-taking is never required. It's always just kind of a supplemental thing, but we do cover a ton of course content on the notes that I provide via lecture, and usually I'm using like a PowerPoint or a Google Slides to give you some imagery, and then I'm giving you supplemental information on top of that. All of my assessments in this class, my quizzes and my exams, are open note. So even if we come back to school semester 2 and have a traditional format, any note taking you do in here, any handwritten notes, I always allow you to use it on any assessments that I give you. I highly recommend you do it because I think note taking and just staying organized in general, kind of collecting thoughts and really key relevant information, I feel like that is an important part of life that can serve you well in all different, professions and career choices, and even just in your personal life down the road. If you're going to college, note-taking is a hugely important thing. So get used to it now, get good at note-taking. Also, don't write down every single thing I say, or even your instructor in college. You don't need to write down every word verbatim, just how they say it, and you don't need to write down every single thing from every slide. I'll kind of emphasize things as we go through, and I'll tell you what is the most important, key, and relevant information. And just a heads up to you, usually 95% of the exam questions on our final assessments, which I only give 4 exams a year, quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4, 95% of those questions come directly from the notes that I give you in class. So make sure you're paying attention. At the very least, you want to watch this whole video and pay attention to it. And I highly recommend that you take notes in some way, shape, or form. Maybe you have a spiral notebook or a pad paper that you're going to use and kind of devote to history class. I would recommend you do it in kind of a traditional way. Just have a spot where you keep some of your history stuff, even the handwritten components of it, and jot that stuff down, and then you'll be ready to go for quizzes and the exams down the road. If you want to take notes and do it on Google Docs or something, really whatever works for you is fine. You'll never turn these in. It's going to be 100% something that just benefits you, but it's not for a grade, but I incentivize it by allowing you to use open notes on all of my assessments. Okay, an important part of note-taking, keep them organized. So I always say anytime you start a new topic or anything, you want to clearly have it labeled what's going to be covered and what's going to be in these notes. First topic that I'm hitting in this class will be the Industrial Revolution. So in the last course material we did, we were talking about the Wild West and kind of America expanding out across the continent. Now we're looking at the same time that was going on. In eastern cities, there was heavy industrialization was kicking in. And what I mean by that is a lot of people are leaving the farms and moving into cities and working in factory jobs. Key fact for you, the Industrial Revolution started in Great Britain, kind of our mother country, our parent country, because originally we were colonies of Great Britain. So the very first textile mills and factories started over in Great Britain. That's the island right there. It's clearly labeled the big red island over in Europe. From there, from Great Britain, it very soon spread into France and Germany, and at the same time it was spreading into continental Europe. It also spread across the ocean to the British colonies over here into the Americas. So the industrialization process had been going on for quite a while, since probably the 1700s. It wasn't like the Industrial Revolution started one day and then ended on a specific other date. It really was kind of a gradual process that has been going on for hundreds of years, and really there's a lot of countries around the world that are just beginning to kind of industrialize today. China and India, they're really going through an industrialization process of their own right now. But it all kind of began in Great Britain, then spread to continental Europe, and then over to the American or the British colonies in America. All right, next up, some of the things that I'm talking about for an industrial revolution, we're talking about technological advances, and I'd want you to have a few examples. So some things, you could jot down a couple of these examples. You might even be able to think of some other examples on your own that would fit into this. But tractors, that's a huge one, because before there were tractors on farms, you had a farmer out there, some local small-time farmer often, that was, hooking up a plow to a mule or to an ox or a horse. Now with tractors, you don't have to water the tractor. You don't have to feed it. You don't have to give it breaks. On hot days, it's not getting exhausted in the same kind of way. As long as you, take care of your machinery, it's going to run for you, and you can be way more efficient and cover more land if you're using a tractor. Steel plows, there were just a lot of advances in metalworking where, originally wood plows were used, but wood plows, they can only run into rocky soil or, tree stumps so many times before they start to break up. But now modern steel plows combined with tractors allowed farmers to become way, way more efficient. So that frees up people. That leads into kind of my next point where the labor supply starts to increase, because not everybody needs to be working on a farm just to feed their family anymore. With farms becoming way more efficient, that freed people up, and many start to move into the cities and look for other opportunities, ways they could put food on the table and maybe have a little extra spending cash. So the labor supply increases, and that frees up a lot more manpower to come in and work in these industrialized centers where the factories are starting to boom. Going back to my first point now, steam engines. This is the era of trains and the locomotive. That was the primary method of transportation if you were going to take a really long trip back in these times. The late 1800s or so is kind of the time frame we're talking about for the American Industrial Revolution, or at least the place that I'm focusing on. Combustion engines, that's what we would have in a modern automobile. Well, cars had been around kind of in the late 1800s. Those are starting to boom. We're getting to that time period where Henry Ford really remakes the auto industry, and he starts to, what he says is, democratize the automobile. He made it, kind of affordable to the common man. That'll be probably a lesson I'm hitting into and digging into deeper next week. Also, the power of electricity is now being harnessed and is often being used in these factories, but electricity, light bulbs, those are all big technological advances, and just our technology, having more technology on the farms definitely allowed for more workers to be freed up, and then they could start looking for other means to provide for their family, many of them going into the cities and working in the factories. Next up, a key word for you that you'd want to understand what I'm talking about here is corporations. I have it bold and underlined there. So a corporation, most of you are probably familiar with that term, that piece of vocab. It's a large company. Now, corporations didn't just start in America in the late 1800s. They'd been around before that, but this is when a lot of modern corporations, kind of how we think of them today, really started to boom and take hold and transform the kind of American culture and landscape. So when you hear of a corporation, we could list a lot off, General Electric or Ford Motor Company, General Motors, Dow Chemical. Those ones are Michigan companies. The first big corporations really kind of took root in this time period, late 1800s and into the early 1900s. So when you hear of a corporation, think of it's where a lot of workers are kind of put all together in one company, and they'll have a management structure where, small businesses have been around forever, where one guy would have a couple employees as managing, but a corporation is on a much larger scale where you'd have to have tiers of management. The guy that owns the corporation or the small group of people that do, they probably don't know the average worker that is employed by them out on the factory floor. So think just the really large-scale companies. Often, unfortunately, these early corporations, there wasn't a whole lot of regulations. There wasn't a whole lot of any kind of government inspectors that would come in. So many of them had really, really poor, just rotten work conditions. I think the image there, this painting often pops into my head when I think of these early corporations where they're dark and dingy, very poorly lit, pretty dangerous, not uncommon for workers to get injured or even killed, for a guy to lose fingers or a hand or something like that in a factory accident. So there we go. Now, as a result of these corporations getting really big and powerful, having a lot of political clout too, many workers are not being treated that fairly. So as kind of a counterbalance to that, or as a reaction to these big corporations gaining a lot of power, workers start to realize that, hey, if one worker is kind of disgruntled and not happy with maybe his pay or his work conditions, and he goes and complains to the boss, he's likely not going to get anywhere. That boss can fire him pretty easily and replace one worker, no problem, at a big corporation. But workers start to catch on to that, and they realize that if they unionize, so a union, another key word for you, that's like all the workers joining together, Henry Ford couldn't just fire every single worker on his factory floor if they're all asking for a raise, or he could do it, but that's going to really put him in a pickle where now his factories are going to shut down. He can hire in a whole new workforce, but then he's got to train them. So his factories would likely be offline for weeks or months, and that's going to really cost him some major money. So unions, by workers joining together and collectively bargaining with the management, as a whole group of them, where they might elect a leader, a union president that's going to go in and talk to the boss man and say, hey, we want a 50-cent raise, and we want safer work conditions, and we want better lighting in our factory. And if you don't do that, the big leverage that the unions had was they could go on strike. So that might be another word that's not on the page there that you might want to write in. A strike is when the workers refuse to work. They're using their labor or a lack of labor as leverage to kind of get what they want from management. So unions are workers banding together to go bargain with the management, the owners, to get better work conditions or better pay, something like that. Next up, two other important vocab words for you that will definitely be, you'll see them again, probably on the quarterly exam, maybe on a quiz coming up, hint, hint, are captain of industry and robber baron. I like throwing these two terms at you because both of them are talking about the exact same group of guys. America didn't have an income tax in the late 1800s and early on in the 1900s. That allowed, and because our economy was booming and the whole society was industrializing, it created a situation where kind of a small group of men who were pretty savvy and smart businessmen were able to just make a killing, and they accumulated just ungodly amounts of wealth. If you look at the 100 wealthiest people in all of human history, five of the top 10 wealthiest people ever on planet Earth were Americans that were living in the late 1800s. Now, some people looked at this group of guys and thought, man, they're providing jobs, opportunity, they're making the country a better place. If you looked at them in a positive light, these guys, you might use a term like captain of industry. Kind of sounds good. They're a captain of industry. They're getting stuff done. They're accomplishing things. But there's kind of the negative, the other side of the coin, looking at them. A lot of people said, hey, man, these guys aren't paying workers very good. Yeah, they might be creating jobs, but they're not really good jobs for people, and they're taking advantage of these workers and using their labor to get rich themselves, but treating a lot of their workers like crap. If you looked at them in that negative light, maybe you were a union boss or something that was arguing against them at the bargaining table, you might call them a robber baron. So just keep in mind, those two terms, you'd want to jot them down. Captain of industry, robber baron, talking about the same group of very wealthy individuals, these wealthy corporation, top corporate guys or business owners from this era, kind of like late 1800s, early 1900s. Captain of industry is the positive term, robber baron, negative term. All right, a few examples that I'm going to give you. I don't want to go too in depth on all of these wealthy robber barons or captains of industry from the time, but I think it's worth noting a few of them. John Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford. First off, the top of my list is Rockefeller. He was an oil tycoon. He basically, I think at his peak, he controlled like 98% of the world's oil market. Now, automobiles were just kind of a new thing at the time. Most people didn't have cars yet. So today when we think of the oil industry, we're thinking of often like diesel and gasoline like engines. That's what the oil is going to be used for. Back at this time, it was all kerosene. That was the big business. Most people didn't have electricity in their homes yet and didn't have electric lighting. So if you wanted to be able to see what was going on in your house after hours, you had a kerosene lamp. And the whole world used kerosene back at that time. John Rockefeller had locked down like 98% of the world's kerosene market. That allowed him to become, when you factor in inflation and everything, he is the wealthiest human being in all of history. So you can go back and look at like the amount of wealth or gold that like Egyptian pharaohs or a king of England might have had. He's wealthier than any of them. In today's money, we're looking at like today, Jeff Bezos, I believe, just edged out Bill Gates, and he's the wealthiest guy in America. Last I heard, I think he's worth 120 or 130 billion. If you factored in inflation, John Rockefeller was worth about $550 billion in today's US dollars. Number 2 on the list was actually pretty darn close to Rockefeller. It's Andrew Carnegie. He had come to America as a poor Scottish immigrant. He's really kind of a self-made man who just was a hard worker, made a lot of very smart business decisions. He was shrewd and also kind of ruthless when it came to managing his business. He ends up becoming the second wealthiest guy in all of human history, and he was a steel guy. So like the American cities that are being built up, the rail lines that are being built, all of that is being done with steel. And he had the biggest steel company in America at the time. A cool little tidbit about him, he'd go around and preach what he'd call the gospel of wealth, and saying that you should work hard your whole life. You should accumulate as much money and wealth as you can, but you know what? When you die, you can't take it with you. It doesn't go to heaven with you. Or hell, depending on which direction you might be heading. So he advocated giving away all of your money before you die. And true to form, he practiced what he preached, and he ended up, he would be worth in today's dollars about $350 billion at his peak. And by the time he died, after he sold out his stock and everything, he had given away about 90% of his money to charity. He gave a ton of money to education. He wanted people to be literate and read. He was a very devout Christian. He wanted to make sure that Bibles were out there, so he bought tons of those and would pass them out to Americans all over the place. He made an impact on us here in Jackson. If you go downtown to the district library, the one that's right in downtown Jackson, that is the Carnegie Library. Like, he donated the money to have that building, that structure built here in Jackson County, and he did that for communities across the country. So kind of a cool little tidbit about him. The last up on the list, he would be the 7th wealthiest man in all of history. So also, when you factored in inflation, he would have been wealthier than like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos is today. And he's the one you might be the most familiar with. It's Henry Ford, because he obviously impacted our state. Ford Motor Company, that's still one of the biggest corporations in Michigan today. I think General Motors is slightly bigger, but Ford was kind of catching up. They've gone back and forth throughout history. He makes his fortune by revolutionizing the auto industry. Begins Ford Motor Company. We're going to get into him in way more detail down the road because we're in Michigan and he's the one that impacted our state the most. But he really made automobiles affordable to the common man. Ends up being the 7th wealthiest man in all of history. I think if they factored in inflation and everything, he would be worth about $250 billion in today's money. All right. I'm at 18 minutes. Generally, I try to keep notes at, for sure, my hard deadline is I don't go over 20 minutes on any of these. I'll usually try to keep them to about 10 to 15 minutes, but sorry, I had to front load it a little bit and was giving you a little bit of explanation and saying why we should take notes and how we go about it. I wanted to recap some of that as I was starting this slide up. So that ate up a couple minutes right at the beginning. Next time, and for following chunks of notes, I probably won't be giving you that explanation every single time as we do this again. You can probably expect notes to come in this format once or twice a week. I'm hoping to get better at it and a little more tech savvy. I want to start using Screencastify. Right now I'm just recording from my iPhone, so I apologize if it looks a little bit cockeyed for you. But hopefully you got all the material you need. If you have any questions over any of this, shoot me an email. Hit me up on Google Classroom. Let me know ASAP, and I'm happy to give clarification and get you the info you need to have. All right, have a great day.